Hello, everyone. My name is Arvin Cito. Welcome to another episode of the Truth About Real Estate Investing show, where we are always here to talk to some of the best minds in the real estate investing space, especially in Canada, so that you may learn their tips and tricks, learn from their knowledge in order to make better decisions in your own investing. And for all you parents with kids in school, did you get your midterm progress reports? We got ours 2 weeks ago. I got home before Cherry that day, so I opened the first for my son. I don't know, I took whatever was on top. So both kids' reports were there. My son Bruce, he's the youngest, and I was pleasantly surprised. He received a grading of about 50-50 between good and excellent. Nothing that needs improvement. I was surprised because his teacher is the same as my eldest, Robin, had last year. So this teacher has had both my kids. My daughter Robin loves to learn, and she's done well in all her school and after school programming. So her original grade 1 teacher, before we moved, because we bought a new house, she said that Robin was a top 2 student in our class. She doesn't hand out compliments easily, but yeah, Robin's kickboxing is among the best among her age group. I've seen her grade, I've seen her train. She's even been invited to be the subject of the gym's training video series. They want to have some kids of the same age as as their potential customers. And Robin's boxing is very sharp. Her technique is very, very good. She likes to, she's a keener. And Robin's also swimming faster than kids 2 or 3 years older than her and a foot taller than her. They're in the same class together. That's how I know how much bigger these other kids are than her. The first day of her lesson, her instructor actually walked right by her, not expecting such a small child would be in his class. After a few weeks, this past week, after class, I checked in with the instructor how my daughter was doing, and I told her how old she was, and he was absolutely shocked. He was shocked by her level of swimming. When I told him how old she was, he actually plans on passing her to the next level, where the kids will be 2 to 4 years older than her, and of course they'll be a lot bigger than her too. Anyways, my daughter reads a couple library books each week. We go to the library once or twice a week to continue to refresh books after she finishes them, and my son finishes his books too. Now she's doing division and math with remainders. She just started remainders. I taught her on Monday how to do division with remainders, what to do with those leftover digits when division doesn't give you whole numbers. Actually, I think it was actually a big relief for her. I think she's got some perfectionist in her. So when you're doing division and it doesn't, and you're left with a remainder, it's like, it's like you didn't do something right. There's something left over. Anyways, reading and math have been excellent for both our kids because we enrolled them in one-on-one tutoring via Kumon. They get tutored 3 times a week, Tuesday, Thursday, one other day, I forget. So they get one-on-one tutoring, and they have homework. They're expected to do homework at least 5 of the 7 days each week. And it hasn't come easy. They don't always want to do their homework, no different than any kid. No different than most adults don't want to have a side hustle. And there is a wee bit of raised voices once a week, at least once a week, to get our kids to do their work, to do their homework. We want our kids to build habits to learn that learning and self-development extend beyond outside the school hours. And in turn, our hope is that translates into them knowing that hustling outside the 9-to-5 workday is a requirement when they grow up. If you want to get ahead, that, and my belief is that people will gravitate towards whatever they're good at. And if kids are good at school, they will enjoy school. It's no different than sports. If your kid shows a talent towards hockey, they're likely going to like hockey. No hockey for my kids though. Anyways, back to the report cards. I opened Robin's next, and my immediate reaction was disappointment. She was about 80-20 good to excellent. So my son completely outperformed my daughter, when my understanding was my daughter was the better student. Anyways, this was so 80-20 good to excellent. This was well below my expectation. I'm an Asian parent. My parents were way tougher on me, and we were trying to raise overachievers. My first thought was, what's wrong with my daughter? did something go wrong in this journey during the pandemic, online schooling, new house, new school, or what does this teacher know about my daughter? So a week after, we have our virtual parent-teacher meetings. Again, Bruce's teacher went first, so she gave Bruce a glowing review. Again, my son's teacher is the same teacher my daughter had last year after we moved homes. And I should mention my son is I say a bit goofy, but he's really goofy. It's not it's not fair, but I often compare him to his sister. Again, his sister is an overachiever who loves to learn, read, and has incredibly technical kickboxing. I would expect so, since they train 3 to 4 times a week at kickboxing grading. So, at our kickboxing club, the kids do have a belt system. White belt, blue belt, red belt. That's their system, whatever. So there's testing. So whenever in the car ride, when we're going to kickboxing grading, right? So this is test day. Like, they're being tested on their ability to kickbox. It's all, they don't actually hit anyone. So it's not an actual fight. But anyways, before, after, and during kickboxing grading, because I attend them, I've attended them all. Some of them I had to attend virtually. So anyways, I coach my son to position himself so that he can always see his sister, so that he can always copy her. If he forgets the combinations and the movements and the techniques, he can always just look at his sister. And his boxing is still sloppy. Sometimes he stands with the wrong foot forward. Sometimes he doesn't even make fists. Sometimes he doesn't look where he's punching. He'll be looking left and be punching to the right. Like, would you ever actually do that in competition or a fight? You'd think it's his first class. You think he's as if he's a beginner, but he's actually had 18 months of training 3-4 times a week. Actually, this past week, I was having dinner with a friend who's a French teacher, and he shared with me how young girls are great students. Generally, they're great students. They're very studious. They're very attentive. And how the young boys, in his experience, are silly, and they cry when they're disciplined. And that's exactly my son. The actual word he used was they're derpy, right? He says it lovingly. He loves kids. He's a wonderful teacher. But I was like, I pointed at him like, that's my son. Anyways, back to the parent-teacher interviews. So Bruce is well above my expectation. Then it's Robin's teacher's turn. So Cherry and I are both on. It's a virtual thing. So we're using Google Classroom, I think. And in my relationship with Cherry, it's often my job to have the difficult conversations in both the workplace and here as well. I'll ask the tough questions. So I asked the teacher if they ever test the kids in English and math. She says no. And then like, it's a big relief off my shoulders, right? It's a big relief for me. Instead, they don't do, that's not for their age group, their grade, whatever. They don't have tests. So her understanding of my daughter's math and English skills is, they ask questions in a group setting. What's 4 plus 4? I'm just giving an example. I don't know what they actually ask, right? Like, what is your understanding of this story? What did this character do, right? My daughter's quiet. She doesn't speak up. She's shy. So again, I feel relieved understanding that I understand now that the teacher doesn't actually have that much data to give my daughter a proper grade. I didn't tell her that. I said, I understand. And I provided her context up to my understanding of my daughter. I told her, I told her how well she's doing at reading and math. Cherry and I, we personally check our kids' homework, so I know exactly what they're doing. My daughter can do multiplication tables 1 to 12 already, right? So she already knows 12 by 12 times 12, right? So I know exactly where she stands. So how we just, and how we just got off like 10 minutes ago on a call with her last year's teacher who loved her, and how her previous teacher loved her even more, right? So in the context, so my understanding of my daughter, I let her know I was disappointed with the contents of the progress report, right? The teacher gives some more context. The year's been disrupted. It is a pandemic. I can probably appreciate how much more work everyone's expected to do. It's crazy. It's sad. It is what it is. And on top of that, my daughter's class actually received, I think, about 7 grade 3s. My daughter's in grade 2, so they received 7 grade 3s. I guess they were orphaned. So now that my daughter's class went from grade 2 to a grade 2-3 split class. So there's been disruption. It's a good number of kids that she has to take care, that she's got to watch. The teacher has to watch over. And I can see, because it's a virtual call, no different than Zoom. I can see the look on both Cherry and the teacher's face that they're not comfortable with me asking these difficult questions and letting her know that I was disappointed in the progress report, and what went into the progress report. I do share with the teacher. I appreciate where she's coming from. I told her it's incredibly difficult, and I told her that I now have context for what went into the preparation of my daughter's progress report. And that's all I say. I'm not criticizing her nor the system. It is what it is. We knew what we were getting. I just know that my disappointment does not lie with my daughter, but rather this experience reinforces my understanding that if one wants to raise world changers, it's going to take more than just school, right? If you want to get ahead in life, it's going to take more than doing whatever you do 9 to 5. So this is no different than those who want financial security, who were not born into privilege. You're going to have to rely on yourself. Not your employer, not your boss, not school, not teachers, not the government. It's up to you. You are the CEO of your life. The year is almost over, so your time to review the CEO is now, right? And are you happy with the CEO's performance? If no, you have some hard conversations and decisions to make with yourself. From my experience, well, we just invited all our clients to a Stock Hackers and Iwan Real Estate client-only holiday dinner. And it warms my heart and Cherry's heart all the thanks we received in making a major financial impact in so many people's lives. I had one young man, I'll ask him to come on the podcast, but he tells me he can now quit his job. And he's an engineer, so he likely makes good money. So he's not even 40 years old. My guess is he's mid-30s. And he can tell me he can quit his job if he wants to. Another gentleman, he's already shared with me in the past that he's quit his job already, and he achieved a 57% return on his stock hacking alone. Plus, he's got a real estate portfolio it's in Ontario, so it went up 30% this last year. By the way, a quick side note, if you're selling your real estate in Ontario to diversify in somewhere else, like Alberta, please let me know. Our clients are buying. Even we're still buying into the strength. I'm buying into the strength. This past week, we witnessed 2 to 30 plus offers on properties that were for sale. The previous week, we witnessed 4 to 30 plus offers. So I think needless to say, there's a lot of demand for properties. So the trend is strong here. Anyways, as the new year approaches, as always, we are offering free training courses in both real estate and stock hacking. You just have to register for free, right? The links are www.investortraining.ca/podcast or stockhackeracademy.ca. Take your pick. Make 2022 the best year ever. I know 2021 was for our family's investments wise, were the best we've ever had. And I love the same for you in 2022, no matter how you get there. Quick PSA, public service announcement. I've heard from a couple of friends who have e-commerce businesses. They've been in e-commerce for several years, like 3-5 years. They've been selling goods on Amazon, and they are struggling and considering closing shop. Some are in the progress of closing shop. So when choosing side hustles, please do your research from both successful and not so successful e-commerce business operators. On to this week's show. We have MCW. We have Michael CollinsWilliams. He is a professional planner and CEO of the West End Builders Association. And previous to that, he spent 17 years at the Ontario Home Builders Association. He is, of course, an expert in planning and policy. He knows exactly what the challenges are for real estate builders, developers. He's here today to share several facts and figures on what is causing the housing crisis and where the challenges and opportunities for the everyday investor lie. I follow Mike on Twitter, Mike at MikeJCW, and recommend all do the same. Please enjoy the show. Hello, Mike. What's keeping you busy these days? Not much, right?
Yeah, not much. It's been very quiet in the real estate and housing world for the last little while. Exactly the opposite. It's funny when COVID first hit. Everybody thought everything would slow down, but that was actually the busiest I'd been during my entire career. Those first 6 to 8 weeks, I don't think I stopped working. Like it was 7 days a week, pulling like 13, 14, 15-hour days, because everything went crazy. I think in particular, the thing that people don't think about a lot when they think about real estate or development or a lot of legal issues is a lot of our legislation, a lot of our permitting, a lot of the way that the world works is based on timelines and clocks. Nobody ever designed these clocks to stop. And all of a sudden, all of the clocks stopped.
Right.
So it created some very interesting legislative and legal quagmires.
Like timelines as in like building milestones to receive more financing, like closing, like finishing developments so they can close.
So all of those things. So
lovely.
When you're working through planning approvals, there are very specific clocks and timelines on zoning or official plan amendments of sort of deadlines. And these aren't just deadlines. These are items that trigger certain legal processes. If you think about on the home buying or the resale side, there's certain things around financing, home closings. If you're buying new housing, there's carry-on timelines in terms of the warranty obligations. And then if you think about the construction side, the people actually building the homes, the entire legal structure of how you get paid is through the Construction Act, and it's all based on timelines. And if there's missed timelines, liens can be levied. And all of a sudden the government said, no, everything stops. It's sort of like, well, it can't.
Yeah.
We
have a plan for how this is going to work if everything stops? Do we get a pause? Does all these timelines get pushed out legally?
It was a very strange few months. We all got through it, but that was truly, in my mind, it's sort of a throwaway phrase now, but the phrase that there was at the beginning of we're all in this together, everybody, government, industry, from the real estate side, municipalities, the province, everybody, I felt really came together, and we all worked our asses off and sort of figured it out, muddled through it. And, that was sort of March, April, May. And by the time June rolled around, some of the timelines, the clocks started again on some things. But there was about 3.5 months where there were some very interesting legal questions as to how does this all work?
Right. Yeah, because thankfully, construction was one of the first things that was considered essential service and could restart working.
Absolutely. And it wasn't by accident that it was considered an essential service. There was a lot of work done by, at the time I worked for the Ontario Home Builders Association, that housing is essential. During a pandemic where people are vulnerable, a roof over your head is essential. And there are a lot of people, not millions, but there are tens of thousands of people across Ontario that had purchased homes, whether it's new or resale, and they have a closing date, but they, in some cases, sold their previous home. So if everything stops, what is going to happen to these people that are caught between the two?
Yeah.
And then on the construction side, there were a lot of health and safety protocols put in very quickly. Most construction is all done outdoors, so they're not in confined spaces generally. One of the things that the government did is they extended timelines on when you can work, because there's noise bylaws around early in the morning or the evening. So on a lot of construction sites, you had to thin out the amount of staff. So if somebody's painting inside a house, there's only one person in that house or in a room. But then if you can double shift by having, a 14, 15-hour workday where you can move shifts around. So there was a lot of creativity in terms of how we operated on site. Again, most construction being outside, and there were a lot of rules put on it. So renovations weren't allowed for a while because you're actually in people's homes that they may be living in. No new construction started, so it was only stuff that was already going. And part of that's a health and safety thing. I mean, if you have a pit in the ground, you can't just walk away from that construction pit for months at a time, just in terms of keeping active construction sites safe. So lots of healthy debate about it, but we were declared an essential service pretty early on. with a lot of rules laid on top of that. But and the other thing I'd say is a lot of people found themselves unemployed. A lot of people went on CERB. I couldn't imagine being in a small business, especially in the hospitality sector. So the residential construction industry did provide a bit of a stabilizing force on the economy through 2020 and early 2021. These are well-paying, highly skilled jobs on construction sites. A lot of people on those construction sites are making six figures. So I think that was pretty important during a very difficult year to keep that segment of the economy moving.
Just for a refresher for the listener, because when we closed on this property that we're in, we closed on this right before the pandemic.
Good timing.
It couldn't have been worse.
So bad timing?
Because I think we bought this place in November 2019. We closed on it I think in March of 2020, right? And then we're trying to renovate this place. It's in a pandemic. It was we're talking about regulations. We're trying to get someone to measure and install blinds for this place. And said, we can't come. The entire building is vacant. We don't live there. You'll be the only person in the building. What risk is there? You're sending one person to come measure. What's the risk? And by the rules, they couldn't do it.
Yeah, there's a lot of, I think everybody over the last couple of years has experienced some frustrations with rules in terms of common sense. I'm empathetic and sympathetic to a lot of people in government. I mean, nobody, whether you're at a local level, provincial level, or federal level, ran for public office with a plan to deal with a global pandemic. There's no playbook as to what to do. I think for a lot of the first few months, everybody was just kind of muddling through it because the data and information kept changing. I mean, I think we all know a lot more about COVID-19 and viruses today than we did on March 13th, 2020 when the pandemic was declared. I think that was the day my wife actually flew out to Peru, so that was quite an adventure. I got trapped in an apartment in Lima for 20-something days. So.
Oh, my Lord.
Yeah, we didn't have lockdowns here. They had lockdowns in other places, like military on the street. So I get a little frazzled when I hear about, how hard done by people were here. And it's okay, yeah, it did suck, but we didn't have the military on the streets with guns telling people to go home.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. We're not going to go down that path. So, Mike, let's take a step back. What do you do for a living?
Let's bring this back to real estate. I'm a professional planner. I've been in the land development and residential construction industry for about 20 years. Graduated from Ryerson University back in 2003. They have a fantastic planning program right at Yonge and Dundas, which is where you want to be when you're learning about cities. Worked briefly with a couple different builders and developers, and then I found myself at the Ontario Home Builders Association. So it is a membership-based organization with 4,000 member companies across the province of Ontario, divided up into 27 local associations, and it's really an integrated network from coast to coast. So there's a Home Builders Association in St. John's, Newfoundland. There's one in Victoria, BC. So if you are involved in the industry, you join at a local level with whichever municipality or city you're with, and then you automatically become part of the provincial and national organization. So I worked for about a decade and a half with the Ontario Home Builders Association, focusing on land development, housing, planning issues at a provincial level. The provincial government really holds the keys to a lot of the issues in terms of the regulatory and legislative landscape around the entire housing, planning, land development system. And then about a year ago, an opportunity came up with the West End Home Builders Association, which is based in Hamilton. And our service area in terms of our membership covers the Hamilton and Burlington area. We have about 300 member companies, 60 of which are home builders, and the balance being other active companies involved in residential construction. We are the largest industry in Canada. A lot of people think of it being automotive or oil and gas. The interesting thing about home building is it's in every community. So whether it's Fort Erie or Thunder Bay or Fort McMurray or Jasper, there are builders in every community. It's one of the few industries that you can't pick up and move your plant to Mexico or China. It is locally based. Our labor is local. Our resources are local. We use lumber from Ontario and Quebec. We use aggregates in terms of the bricks and concrete from the ground in Ontario. And we employ hundreds of thousands of people, about 500,000 across Ontario, either directly on site through the skilled trades, people like myself that are urban planners, people like you in the real estate sector. We are sort of the engine that drives Ontario and Canada's economy.
That's funny because we get such a bad name.
I've always found that troubling. There's three things people need to survive, and that's food, water, and shelter. And we're in the business of providing shelter and building and creating communities.
And jobs.
And jobs, well-paying jobs. I also think it's a fun, dynamic, interesting sector. Whether you look at urban design, architecture, I love the idea of creating things and being able to walk through a community that might not have existed there 5 or 10 years ago. And a home is where people, that's where their families grow up. That's where they create memories, whether it's Stanley Cup winning saves on the driveway or the Christmas tree floating above presidents in the living room, or, the barbecue in the backyard, or, a cool loft or high-rise condo that you have your friends over to. Like, the home is sort of where the heart is and where you create memories and where people grow up.
Mm-hmm. Yet we still get a bad name. And I know we didn't mean to be political, but I remember someone running for federal government. I'll just say Orange for the party, and I remember them saying that they wanted to support developers, preferably co-ops, because they didn't want for-profit developers making money off Canadians.
Well, we live in a capitalistic society.
And co-ops run so well.
Well, some of them do run well.
Apologies, just top of mind, Mountain Quippa Co-op, Mustard Seed Co-op in Hamilton.
There were a lot of co-ops built in Toronto in particular in the 1970s, and a lot of them are doing well. It is a different model. We don't really build co-ops today. I do think it's a viable model. I think...
Oh, no, ownership, I believe, is a good model. For business co-op, I think it's a completely different story.
Okay, yeah, I'm talking about housing, I guess. We desperately need more housing supply of all types and tenures. Be that government-built social affordable housing, because there is a component of society that the private market just is not going to be able to service. But 90 to 95% of the housing built in the province of Ontario is built by the private sector.
Sorry, 99%?
90 to 95,
90 to
depending
95, okay.
on the year or maybe the stripe of government in power. And the private sector, I'll be blunt, we haven't been able to keep up with population growth.
Why not?
That's a very good question.
Come on, just
There's a few threads we could pull there. I think I know where you want me to go, so I am going to go there. But there's two major issues in terms of when I think of our industry, the residential constructions industry, the development industry, in terms of our supply chain. Land is our supply chain. That is what we need, and that's not just suburban. That's urban. That's those corners in a downtown that could be redeveloping sites through brownfields, which is formerly contaminated lands, or gray fields, which are old malls built in the 60s or 70s that aren't performing anymore, or greenfield lands. The other supply chain that we have trouble with is skilled trades and labor, which we could get into. It's a bit of a different conversation, but we don't have enough labor to build the amount of housing we need to build, or the amount of hospitals or schools or infrastructure for our growing population. Canada's growing. We're growing very rapidly, and there are challenges and opportunities. I think growth is a good problem to have. There's a lot of countries in the world that aren't growing. There's a lot of parts of Canada that aren't growing. But if you look at Canada, most of the growth is going to two places: Vancouver and the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area. The federal government just increased immigration targets. The recently re-elected Trudeau government's international immigration pre-pandemic was sort of 250 to 300,000 a year. They've increased that target to 400,000. And part of the idea of post-pandemic recovery is to bring more of the best and the brightest from around the world to Canada to live, to work, and to contribute to our society.
Hopefully some of these are tradespeople.
I really hope some of these are tradespeople. I think we've made some mistakes in the
Sorry.
past.
Let's just pause there. For those who are not for growth or anti-growth, we have job vacancies. How do you expect?
My industry
how do we fill it without growth?
People. We desperately need people. A lot of Ontario, and I guess probably a lot of your listeners are in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area.
We have some from out of province.
This part of the country was built by immigrants from Eastern Europe, Italians, Poles, from the former Yugoslavia. Okay. The physical world that we see around us was generally built by immigrants coming from parts of Europe in the late 60s, 70s, and early 80s. Our immigration policies changed. We shifted to more family reunification and looking for other professions. For better or for worse, I think some people look down at the skilled trades. So that wasn't necessarily what we've been bringing into the country for the last 2 or 3 decades. Yet that's where the job vacancies are. That's what we need. In terms of young people growing up in Canada, I think part of our academic system has done a bit of a disservice that we, and even parents as well, they want their kids to be a lawyer or a doctor, not a plumber or a carpenter. But I'll go back to one thing I said earlier. A lot of these trades, you're making 6 figures in your 20s, and you have the opportunities you grow through your career to start and run your own business. Yeah. You can make a lot of money. You get to work with your hands and build something. This is where our greatest deficiency is, and one of the biggest challenges in our industry. You or your listeners would be shocked. Show up at a construction site and walk around. You'd be shocked by the average age. There's a lot of older people doing a lot of the work, building our highways, our transit lines in the homes. There aren't enough young people seeking careers in construction. And there's a wave of retirements coming, which is a concern to our industry. So that's an opportunity for young people in terms of careers. It's a bit of this gray tsunami coming, and that is contributing to housing price escalation because the cost of labor is not increasing at the rate of inflation. It's increasing at an exponential rate. Yeah.
Anyone who's had jobs quoted knows, like my friend who I bought my house from, he had a pool installed. The pool itself was $50,000, and then when he bought another house like 3 years later, the price for the pool was $100,000. Same pool, same vendor.
It's wild, and
3 years, double.
I hear stories like that all the time, yeah. and part of it is because there's the lack of trades. Sometimes they throw out crazy quotes because they're just so busy. Yeah. They don't even want the job. Yeah. They're too busy for the job, so they just throw out a crazy quote, and then people pay it.
Yeah. And to go back to your point about trades, like Steve Kulikowski, who's been on the show, a friend of the show, like he started as a trade and then got into the business of being a developer.
Most of the major players, I'll call in terms of the larger developers, it's not a corporate industry. It is sort of a big money industry in terms of capital investment and on the business side, but the culture isn't corporate. The culture is a bit different because a lot of the companies are family businesses. Some of them are 2nd and 3rd generation businesses. And a lot of them, the principals literally started by digging trenches, laying bricks. These are people that worked from the bottom right to the top. And they know all facets of the business. They're not, somebody that went to get
business
their
school.
MBA business school and ran a business. It's like, no, they literally built houses with their hands.
Yeah.
And now run these large companies. So they know the business inside and out. So it is an opportunity as well to get your hands dirty, to learn the business, to build something. and then to strike out on your own and contribute to your community and create new housing supply.
Back to the point about like lack of skilled trades, I've told lots of young people, learn a skilled trade, work on jobs, and you'll become a better real estate investor for it, right? You can go do your MBA later. You don't have to do it before. Do it at some point if you want to go scale big. Still not necessary. But again, like, you know, I see people want to be TikTok and Instagram influencers and then become a developer. Okay, that could work.
You might want to try starting to build something. Start with a back porch. Start with a shed. You know, there's opportunities to get an apprenticeship, which is interesting because instead of going to pay tuition and go to school for years and maybe get a job, you're getting paid right away. Mm-hmm. You're on the job site right away. You're learning on the job. So it's a great career path. It would be great if more high schools had shop class and exposed teenagers to the opportunities at a younger age.
Which is funny because I remember in elementary school we did have shop class. I don't know how things are these days, but it was widely enjoyed, like shop class, like just doing some simple things. Like I made a baseball bat, I remember, in high school.
Because you also learn a variety. You become a more well-rounded person learning a variety of skills. But to go back to one of your earlier questions, the other area of supply, going back to sort of the housing supply and the land issue is it's our legislative and regulatory framework. Government actually controls basically everything through the process in terms of where you can build, what you can build, and when you can build it. It is not the Wild West out there. Some of the projects out there are literally 10 years through approvals. I'm not exaggerating. It is wild on the low-rise side. I sometimes hear people, the suburbs, houses springing up, and it's like, yeah, they started their planning approvals in the late 90s in terms of acquiring the land, the whole issue of the urban boundary expansion, where we're going through a debate in Hamilton on an urban boundary expansion. I don't think council's going to approve it, but even if they did approve it, the first building permit, it's not going to be pulled for 8 or 9, maybe even 10 years, because they've got to go through secondary plans, block plans, all of the infrastructure planning. So the approvals take forever. And then even once you get in the ground, you've got to build all of the infrastructure. So it's a very capital intensive industry. It's high risk because of how political it is. There aren't many other industries out there where you need a political approval for everything you do. I mean, could you imagine if you were a car manufacturer and every car you built, you needed to get somebody to approve to build that next car? That's part of the reason why we have a housing supply crisis is local control over planning. Mm-hmm. Everything's political. People hate urban sprawl. People hate tall buildings.
People hate everything.
There's sort of 3 general housing typologies. There's the intensification that's more of the transit-oriented high-rise, mid-rise buildings. Incredibly controversial. Everything, because we don't have proper zoning, everything requires a rezoning or an official plan amendment. Sorry to get technical, which can be a 2 or 3 year process if it goes smoothly. If it doesn't go smoothly, you're going through an appeals process, which adds another couple of years, so you're 4 or 5 years. Generally starting out with public meetings where there's lots of angry people that they don't want their neighborhoods to change. I think it's generally a fear of change. People move somewhere, they like it just the way it is.
Well, it's disruption to them.
Yeah, and it's kind of like...
No one likes driving through a construction zone.
Yeah, once you move somewhere, it's kind of like, well, I'll close the door behind me. Nobody else can move in.
I know. That's like rent control, for example. It's great if you're existing tenant and you're not planning on moving anywhere. What about the next person trying to rent a place out?
If any of your listeners are interested in learning about rent control, look up Sweden and Stockholm. There's like a 20-year wait list just to get into buildings because they don't build anything because the rent control is so tight. There was a famous economist that once said, after carpet bombing a city, the second worst thing you can do is add rent control. Right.
I believe a U.S. state just passed it as well. They're capping rent increases at 3% a year. Yeah, let's see what gets built.
I think we've got a pretty balanced system here. We have vacancy decontrol in which the unit isn't protected, the tenant is protected. So once you move in, It's probably going to be 2 or 3% capped annual increases. So that tenant has stability, but once the tenant moves out, the unit resets to market. So this still encourages private sector investment to build new rental or to upgrade or improve existing rental properties. If you have complete rent control, nobody's going to build anything, like at all. And then why would you be incentivized to improve that property? So, we went through a long period in Southern Ontario through the 90s and early 2000s where nobody was building anything. Right now, there's more purpose-built rental under construction than since like the early 80s, late 70s.
That's government funded, right? They're the ones building all this?
It's all private sector.
All private?
All private sector. But
the devil.
It's because there is a permissive, there's an environment, a regulatory environment that's encouraging investment, which is helpful. And then the other part is population growth, which I'm sure we'll get to at some point in the podcast. But like we're growing like crazy.
1% a year we're growing by. Canada as a whole.
So I'll go to Ontario because that's sort of where I know the data best.
Please.
We spoke about the 400,000 coming annually in Canada, which is going to put even more pressure on growth. But in Ontario, 2010 through 2015, we grew by about 600,000 people. That growth accelerated from 2015 to 2020, the next 5 years, to 1 million people. So not quite doubling, but a significant increase in growth. Now, the housing supply is inelastic. You would think if the growth has increased that much, the amount of new housing starts, be it ownership or rental, would have skyrocketed. It didn't. The city of Toronto in particular barely budged in terms of the amount, despite all the cranes you ski on the skyline.
Because there's a lot.
There's a lot, but it has not responded to the increased amount of growth. It's roughly stayed the same. The other reason why you see so many cranes on the skyline is, 10, 15 years ago, the cranes would come and go because they're building 20 or 30-story buildings. When you build a 50 or 60-story building, there's a crane there, but the crane's there for 5 years instead of 2 years. So there's more units under construction now, but they're taking a lot longer to build. So it is a good thing that we're building so much. We are trying to respond to growth, but there is just so much growth and so much demand that supply is just not keeping up.
Right. And we see it reflected in the real estate prices and the rents.
And that data that I just sort of mentioned about going from 600,000 to 1 million, if you look at the price growth, the year it really started jumping up was 2016. I know everything's been crazy the last couple of years through the pandemic, but that curve really started going from, a general regular increase to, I'll call it being a little detached from economic realities. And that is because of the population growth and the gap between demand and supply.
Sorry, what happened in 2016? Did we just open up immigration more?
A few things happened. Part of it's the immigration. Part of it is some changes in federal policy around non-permanent residents. So this is a good problem. It's not even a problem. This is a good issue to have, that the best and the brightest from around the world are choosing Canada. And they're choosing the GTA and Hamilton areas to settle. We have some of the highest quality of life here, great opportunities for business, and in particular, a lot of fantastic post-secondary institutions. Around the same time, the provincial government changed some of the rules in terms of how they fund post-secondary institutions. So a lot of these colleges and universities, they can make a lot more money in terms of tuition if somebody's coming from China, India, France, the United States, wherever. So they were suddenly increasing their enrollments for these non-permanent residents coming in. And a lot of those non-permanent residents, in terms of the students, they don't just go to school here and then go back home. A lot of them stay. So this is great. We're attracting the best and the brightest from around the world. Something else happened in 2016. Some things changed in the United States. We'll call it the Trump effect. Let's just say the best and the brightest from around the world. That whiz kid engineer from New Delhi, or somebody from Ukraine, or a potential doctoral candidate from Hong Kong. Are they looking at Boston and San Francisco for post-secondary institution in terms of furthering their education and starting out their lives? Is the United States still that, shiny city on the hill? I think a lot of things changed in terms of, especially around immigration in the United States, and Canada benefited from that. We were attracting people that might have wanted to go to MIT or Berkeley or something like that. They're now going to UBC in Vancouver or U of T in Toronto. And, even though things have changed a bit in the United States in terms of who's president, I think there is still some global hesitancy. And I think Canada's greatly benefited. But we're still, students still need somewhere to live. And that is part of the challenges that my industry has in terms of the two things we mentioned, the labor supply in terms of building the necessary amount of housing, and the painfully slow approvals process that is putting a limit on how much we can build.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And just to take a step back, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe cost of living for a student is cheaper in Toronto, Vancouver than it would be for Boston or San Francisco.
I think that might have been the case a number of years ago, but the cost of housing's really getting out of control. There was an Oxford economics study released back in the summer that compared not just the end price of housing, but the average income of a community and the average cost of housing in a community, and how that compares, right? Because salaries are still higher in San Francisco, and the end cost of housing might be more. But when you correlate those two things, the most expensive places in North America are not San Francisco and Boston. It's Vancouver, Toronto, and you would have never guessed this. The third most expensive place is Hamilton, Ontario.
Oops.
That's a problem.
That's a big problem.
And
because my immediate thought is, how do we continue to attract talent if our housing isn't affordable? If our cost of living isn't affordable, housing being a big component of cost of living.
and that is the million-dollar question, I think, that our federal and our provincial governments need to figure out for the long-term economic prosperity and quality of life for this country, because we have an aging population that is going to be entering the years that they're applying more pressure on our healthcare system. So we need to continue to attract talent. We need to continue to grow our economy. And, I'll use the word crisis. We are in a housing crisis, and I'm worried it's going to get a whole lot worse before it gets better. And Toronto, Vancouver, and Hamilton, Hamilton's not competing against Waterloo, and Toronto, in my mind, is not competing against Montreal. Toronto's competing against New York City and Miami and San Francisco, and Hamilton's competing against, the same places or some medium-sized American cities like Pittsburgh or like Austin, Texas. When the cost of housing comes into the equation, I'm biased. I think our quality of life's probably better here and we have more to offer. But when the average cost of a home has, doubled in the last 5 years, it's one thing if you're already in the market and you are benefiting from the upside. I couldn't imagine being 25 years old today and trying to figure this out. You can do all the right things. You can go to school. You can get a good education. You can get a great job. It's kind of generation screwed.
Oh, totally. And I'm one of the people, a lot of the listeners on the show, we've benefited. We've made a lot of money, but it's not good for society.
It's a big problem because it's we were talking about attracting and retaining talent, because young talent is mobile. They will leave.
Yeah. Young people with kids, they'll go anywhere where opportunity is.
It used to be people would, leave Toronto and go to Hamilton because it's a little more affordable, and there's the whole displacement effect happening. But, I've talked to a couple people in the last few months that they haven't done the typical, I'm leaving Hamilton because St. Catharines is a little cheaper. It's like they've just given up. And they're like, I'm moving to Halifax.
Yeah, I've heard those things.
Which is not a good problem for somebody that's in their early 20s, just basically completely giving up on this market. Yeah.
I've read some stories, people moving to Japan.
Yeah, are we going to end up with a bit of a brain drain of young people that will get educated here and say, screw it, I'm leaving? screw it, I'm leaving. If they can't foresee being able to get into the market. A different city, but my brother's an interesting story. He had a great job in Vancouver. His partner, his wife, was a lawyer, so dual income, no kids, loved downtown Vancouver. As soon as they had a kid, they sort of look around the tiny apartment and said, "Oh, I don't think this is going to work, but we will never, ever, ever be able to afford a house in Vancouver." So they left. They moved to Edmonton. And I think that's a story that's going to play itself out more in this region in southern Ontario is housing prices hit for the stratosphere, that people are going to vote with their feet and they're going to leave.
Do you see more of that happening? Do you see where do you see population of Ontario then? Because we do have a fair number of Ontario listeners. Are we still going to be net gainers? Are we going to be net losers?
I think we're going to still gain overall because we are, in a global economy where there are a lot of places with difficult political environments. Canada is still going to be seen as a place of stability. So I think we are going to keep growing and growing significantly. But the cost of housing is a problem, and young people are delaying getting married. They're delaying starting families because they're trying to save up to get that down payment on a first home or a first condo. And young people are leaving Toronto. We commissioned some research. The West End Home Builders Association commissioned some research by the Smart Prosperity Institute, run by Dr. Mike Moffat, looking at this.
I follow him on Twitter. He's excellent.
If any of your listeners type it in Twitter right now, look up Dr. Mike Moffat. He is a wealth of knowledge and insights around demographics specifically in the housing market.
Oh, can you share your Twitter too? I follow you on Twitter too.
I am at Mike JCW. I am not as interesting as Mike Moffat, but I do like to tweet, about urban planning issues, about housing issues, different funky, cool architects from Europe, and anybody that likes death metal, you might get a little bit of that thrown in there. But Mike Moffat's done some very interesting research looking at demographic shifts and patterns happening in Ontario, and I'll call it a bit of a cascading effect going from the CN Tower outwards. You have a lot of people that simply, they get into the market in Toronto, they may be going to school there, they may be renting or have a small condo. Similar to my brother's story, as soon as they get into their early 30s in their child-rearing years, they look around that one-bedroom condo and sort of say, yeah, this isn't going to work. So the Smart Prosperity Institute research found that over the last year in Toronto and Peel, some of the most expensive markets and the highest density markets, 60,000 people left on net to other areas of Ontario. And I mentioned earlier in the podcast the whole almost doubling of growth over the last decade in Toronto not building any more housing. So where's this growth all going? It's not all going to Toronto in the inner sort of GTA, the Peel, York, and Durham that it traditionally had in previous decades. You have other areas of the province growing rapidly. And there's this cascading effect of people, and the biggest demographic group leaving Toronto is ages 0 to 5 and 3 to 30, with the number one age leaving Toronto being 0. So these are basically young families that have just had their first or second child, and they're leaving because they want a little more elbow room and something that's a little more affordable. So where are they going? They're going to communities like where I'm working in Hamilton. They're going to Barrie, sort of that immediate ring around sort of the inner GTA.
Right.
And now these communities are experiencing a rapid escalation in growth. But what's it doing to those communities? Because you have people with Toronto salaries. In some cases, you have people selling pretty expensive condos in Toronto to then buy their first ground-oriented home in these other communities. So they have more resources at their disposal in terms of financial resources. In places like Hamilton, where we are not building enough housing to meet demand, you have a lot of people from Toronto bidding up housing. I'm one of them. I'm leaving Toronto because I just got a job in Hamilton, and I've become pretty frustrated that every house I look at, I don't mind if there's one or two other people looking at it, but when I find out that there's 8 bids, 9 bids, and the home's going for between 100 and 200 over asking, like I just want to smash my head against a brick wall. But that's the reality of what's happening now. So what happens to people from Hamilton? Well, they're now being displaced. And that Smart Prosperity Institute report by Mike Moffat found that over the last 5 years, 15,000 people that were from Hamilton left. Where did they go? They went up the QEW to St. Catharines or down the 403 to Brantford and Woodstock. Okay, well, what happens to people from St. Catharines, Brantford, and Woodstock? So you have this cascading effect going out from the CN Tower, and the housing affordability or cost of housing issues that we were all talking about 10, 15 years ago was all about Toronto. But now you'd be shocked. What do you think the fastest growing places in Ontario are?
I'm having trouble because they're all growing so fast. Like Windsor, I don't know.
Places like Shelburne, Tillsonburg, Collingwood, places that were not part of the provincial growth plan, places that were never envisioned for this type of growth, and quite frankly, places that don't have the infrastructure to deal with it.
Right.
But people are
I know Collingwood's struggling with their infrastructure now.
Yeah, they've run out of water capacity, so you can't pull any building permits in Collingwood for a while. If you can't flush your toilet, you can't build a house.
Right. So we
but
don't have, and it's also far from CN Tower.
and some people are retiring, but other people are commuting vast distances. I think through the pandemic, some people are able to work remotely or do a hybrid thing where maybe they're going to the office 1 or 2 days a week, but the commute from Woodstock or London to go into an office in Toronto a couple days a week, that's not great for greenhouse gas emissions. That's not great for the amount of time that you're sitting in traffic on the highway. So this housing affordability issue is stretching all across Southern Ontario, and the places that are experiencing the most rapid growth were sleepy little places that did not plan for this growth, did not expect this growth, and now it's here.
Right. I don't even know where Tillsonburg and Shelburne are. I only know Collingwood because I ski up there once in a while. So, at any point do you see meeting supply in Ontario? Because what I'm trying to get to is where are housing prices going? Because for the beginner, for the layman, a lot of them always think, oh, it's gone up so high, it can only come down from here.
That's a great question. So I don't have a crystal ball.
Oh, neither do
and
I.
I don't think so. I can't speak to the shocks to the system like 2008, 2009, or COVID, or the cyclical nature of year in, year out. Like I think there will still be ups and downs. Mm-hmm. But overall,
we have an idea what demand is, and you have a pretty clear picture on what supply is going to look like.
Well, Mark Twain once said, "Buy land; they're not making any more of it." And
I heard there's virtual land you can buy now with NFTs and stuff. We're not going to go down there.
Can't live there. So yeah, the long term. I don't think government's going to figure this out. I think it's probably going to get worse. And it's interesting. A lot of people complain that it's all investors buying up these properties. And well, most investors that buy a property rent it out. So it's not sitting vacant, it's still on the market.
Yeah, and we're creating rental supply.
And if you're sitting on a vacant property, I'm sorry, you're stupid because you could be making a lot of money renting it out.
Because I don't know anyone personally doing that.
Yeah.
Cottages don't count.
But in terms of investment, I don't think there's a lot of people out there investing in property in Indianapolis or Saskatoon or places that aren't growing. People that are investing in property are pretty much making a bet that government's going to keep screwing this up and that the market's going to keep going up, because the only way that we are going to get out of this rapid price escalation is if demand falls off a cliff, and I don't see the immigration train stopping because, we touched on it before, we desperately need labor, we got jobs to fill, we need people, or the supply problem is reversed. I'm cautiously optimistic that we can make some public policy changes around supply. It was interesting that during the last federal election, I'm going to say it in a nonpartisan way, all three major parties had a lot of housing stuff in their platform. I think the upcoming provincial election in June regardless of partisan stripe. Housing is such a big issue that all three parties are going to have a lot of housing stuff in their platforms. So it's caught the attention of government, but we're so far behind the eight ball. And a lot of the solutions, quite frankly, are politically difficult. We touched on NIMBYism before about people not wanting their neighborhoods to change. And on the Greenfield issue in Hamilton, there's a big debate, a boundary expansion. And there's a lot of noisy people out there that, there's no elegant solution. If you are going to build new houses, it's going to be on farmland because we're not going to touch environmentally sensitive lands. So there's no easy solution. All of the solutions are hard. And governments don't have a great track record of making hard decisions.
Because they'll be unpopular with a lot of their voter base.
They will be potentially unpopular with a lot of their voter base. But the flip side is, I'm not very worried, but I'm a little worried that in the long run, there could be political or social instability if more and more young people become disenfranchised. I think we saw a little bit of it federally with the rise of the PPC. I know that they were focused on anti-vax stuff, but I think part of that does come from there's a lot of angry people out there, and there's a lot of people being left behind.
Or even just like Occupy Wall Street, like that
Yes.
same thing. People are getting left behind.
So where are we going to be in 5 or 10 years if more and more young people who do play by the rules, who do get educated, who do get good jobs, and it's just sort of, sorry, you'll never have that great Canadian dream of home ownership.
They better pray their parents were preparing for this.
I saw a great billboard put up somewhere like, can't
yes.
afford a house. Have you tried richer parents? That's not a great place for us to be in society where if you have generational wealth, like, okay, you're okay. But if you're a hardworking young person or if you're a new Canadian, like, good luck.
Yeah. Hopefully your parents started your RESP sooner, preferably in real estate. So, Mike, we're running out of time. I wanted to get this question. You know many big builders. You also know lots of small builders, like our mutual friend Charles Waugh. So we have lots of listeners who are interested in development. They have where can a small real estate investor developer start?
It's a great question.
And is there opportunity for them?
There's opportunity. There's lots of opportunity, but it is not. There are barriers to entry in the industry. Charles is awesome. Charles, if you're listening, hello. Charles sits on the board of directors at the West End Home Builders Association. So in our association, we have a diversity of builders. We have low-rise builders that build ground-oriented suburban communities. We have high-rise builders, and we have infill builders like Charles. And a lot of the infill builders are smaller, I'll call them niche sort of custom builders. That's sort of the easy isn't the right word, but that is probably where there is the path of the easiest path for a smaller investor to get in. Because if you're starting out, you're probably not going to build a 20-story building or buy multiple lots and build a subdivision. You're looking for a well-located piece of property somewhere within the existing urban area, maybe well serviced by transit or near a cool, funky retail strip. So how do you start out? It's complicated. There are regulatory barriers. If you are going to sell for ownership, you need to be a licensed builder. So you need to be registered with the Tarion Warranty Corporation.
Or you can hire a registered builder.
Or you can hire a registered builder. So there are some barriers to entry, but for good reason, because we don't want fly-by-the-nighters or the underground sort of economy that put consumers at risk. We need to have a housing system where it's good people, good builders that can deliver on their promises. On the rental side, there's lots of opportunity as well. You don't need the registration. You also don't necessarily need to start from scratch. You can buy a home and renovate it and create multiple units in an existing home. Hamilton's a great example. One of the good things Hamilton did is they just passed a secondary dwelling unit bylaw, which allows for secondary suites. That could be a basement apartment, a granny flat. I call it the Fonzie suite, sort of the home above the garage. Like the old Happy Days show. So there's opportunities there on a small scale, and this is sort of what I call the missing middle of housing. It's sort of in that middle space. It's not low rise, low density. It's not high rise, high density. It's semis, quadplexes, townhomes. This is the opportunity for smaller scale builders or developers to come into a neighborhood or a community and slightly increase the densities by providing more housing opportunities in existing communities that already have infrastructure and services.
It's funny you mentioned. So, how far how far are we from doing garden suites in Hamilton as a third unit?
We just got the second unit. The third unit, it's something we want to work on. So Vancouver allows 3 units. New Zealand just passed federal legislation. So New Zealand's far away, but I do think it's an interesting example of they have a similar, I'll call it housing crisis as us, where there's been rapid escalation, where local municipalities are more of a barrier and a hindrance to the delivery of new supply because every approval is a political approval. So the federal government kind of just threw their hands up and said, well, we're going to move the municipalities out of the way and change the zoning so every single property, no matter what, is allowed to have 3 units on it without going through a long permitting rezoning process.
And build up to 3 stories.
Yeah,
and cover 50% of their lot. 3 stories seems a bit much. I don't need to go 3 stories.
Let's go 4. Let's go 5. I'm
true.
Proponent of pushing local governments out of the way because they're the problem. They are the guardians in terms of approvals, and they are primarily, in my view, why we're in this mess because they respond to local political pressures and they often say no rather than yes. Or even when they say yes, it takes 3, 4, 5 years to get there, and then you're negotiating away. Like, I don't know the difference when I'm on a street corner between a 21 and a 24-story building, yet it seems to be a big political victory for a municipality to shave 3 stories off a building because it'll cast a slightly less shadow. And I'm scratching my head saying, we're in the middle of a housing crisis and you just lost 30 units of housing. I can't tell from the street corner the difference between 21 and 24 stories, but that's 30 homes for people.
And just an example of how ridiculous some of the NIMBYism is. I know McMaster is trying to build, I forget how many stories tall, a student residence, right? And if you're a resident of that area, you should be excited to see students being consolidated into one building so that they're out of the neighborhood, right? So if I was living in that area, I'd be like, build it as high as you can so we get all the students into one building so they're not in the neighborhoods. We don't have sprawl of students into the neighborhood. But no, the neighborhood association opposes it. I don't get it.
There's a lot of that, and I would say that there is a difference between the local interest and the public interest. The local interest is often a particular demographic, typically existing homeowners, typically much older, that show up to these public meetings and create political pressure. I'll call them the retired teachers club, create political pressure for councillors to say no to new housing supply. That's not the public interest. In the middle of a housing crisis.
That's self-interest.
Yeah.
You're rich. You have your house.
The public interest is to have a stable housing system in which there is a balance between supply and demand and not one type of supply. We need a diversity of options for people's full life cycles. A 21-year-old college student has different housing needs than a 40-year-old with 2 kids who has very different housing needs than a 70-year-old
empty nester,
right? So we need choices in the marketplace, and we need choices in tenure. We need rental supply and we need ownership, and perhaps we need some co-ops, and we need some government-funded housing, and right through the scale, right to sort of homelessness with supportive housing, because there are some people out there that require supports that the private sector cannot deliver. And I think that there's been a failure across the board in terms of being able to deliver all of this.
So, Mike, what can it's politicized. I've been called a slumlord by people who have no idea how I operate my business. Is it bad to be a small real estate investor?
Oh, we're going to get into the moral and ethical part of the conversation. I think the housing providers are doing incredible work. It's difficult work. I'm puzzled in some ways by some of the public perception of our industry. I will say this: I think we are judged by the worst apples out there. And I'll be first to say there are some bad builders out there.
Oh, yeah.
There's some bad
terrible landlords
out there.
Oh yeah.
And
I've been to LTB. I've seen the terrible ones. They're horrific.
And the newspaper columns and the social media don't really cover the best of the best. They cover the horror stories, and there are horror stories out there.
To be fair, they also share the horror stories of professional tenants who are horrific people. The media's good at that.
So, and I recognize that we as an industry probably can and should do a better overall job. But I'm excited for the future in some ways. I see my members in particular looking internationally to Europe and other jurisdictions and bringing over more cool, funky architects, being more focused on urban design. The missing middle that we were just talking about, I think, is really exciting in terms of not just creating new neighborhoods, but revitalizing existing older neighborhoods. Because there's a lot of neighborhoods in some cities that are actually declining in population, which is rather shocking. But if you think of Toronto, some of those neighborhoods along the Bloor-Danforth subway line, which is, an incredible piece of infrastructure built 60 years ago, and if you look at the census tract data, some of those neighborhoods have actually declined in population. Areas like Riverdale and the Annex, back in the 1960s and 1970s, a lot of those homes were multiple apartments. People had larger families. The schools were full. And then today, they've been converted back from multiple apartments to single-family homes where you have young couples not having as many kids. You multiply that over a whole neighborhood, population's lower. Oh, and guess what? The zoning hasn't been changed in 50 years, so you can't build that missing middle housing. You can only build single-family homes or tear down a home and replace it with a home.
I just want to highlight that fact. It's easier to take a fourplex and bring it to a single-family home than it is to take a single-family home to...
And that's why our system is screwed up. We need a more permissive regulatory framework, not so builders or developers can come in and build towers in neighborhoods, but maybe we can build a fourplex. Maybe we can build a townhouse and provide that diversity of opportunities. And look, a single-family home is going to cost more than a townhome or a semi. So this isn't about, people confuse housing affordability and affordable housing. Affordable housing is below market housing that requires a subsidy or a partnership between government and the private sector to deliver. But housing affordability is about a scale of attainable housing for, your average middle class person, and allowing for more housing types in existing neighborhoods like a townhouse or that fourplex, or a home with a basement apartment that maybe they're renting out for $700 or $800 a month. That creates a mixed income community where there are more opportunities for people at different stages of their life to live in that community. Right now we have a system where I'll call it exclusionary zoning, where there are vast swaths of Toronto, of all of the 905 municipalities, of London, of Ottawa, where the only thing you can build is a single family home. That's a problem.
So, and then just to highlight, if you already own real estate, this is all good stuff for you to hear. If you don't own real estate, this is all terrible news.
Yeah, but even if you own real estate, there's the opportunity, hopefully in the future, through a more permissive framework, that you can renovate and provide. We talked about small scale investors getting into the game in terms of being able to build new supply. A more permissive framework would encourage not the big developers, but would encourage a lot of these smaller scale entrepreneurs to get in the business and become housing providers.
Yeah. Private
That's a
money
great thing.
creating more housing supply.
Like we don't need more public sector money necessarily. Like we're one of the only industries.
Yeah, we don't need it. We're not asking for it.
We don't go to government and ask for money. There's so many other industries out there or businesses that are asking government for money. We don't need government's money. We just need government to get out of the way. And we can do what we do best, and that's build more housing.
So, Mike, thank you so much for your time. I could sit here with you all day. I know, but you're a busy guy. You have more important things to do. Anything else you'd like to share without me leading you with a question? What can people do to? Because I think if you're adding housing supply, even if you're just not creating more housing, but you're creating rental supply, you've improved society. That's just my opinion.
What can one do?
Join
I'm an urban. Join the West End Home Builders Association.
Okay.
I'm an urban planner, and I guess I have odd things I like to do for fun. But prior to the pandemic, every now and then I'd go to like a public meeting and just quietly sit in the back corner when a building is proposed in an existing community, and you see the fire and pitchforks out. I think some listeners would be pretty surprised as to how local democracy works and who is influencing politicians, and you will see why we're in a housing crisis. So yeah, go to a public meeting when you can, when something's proposed in your neighborhood. And you know what? Speak up. Say that we need more housing. But I think it would be eye-opening to some listeners to see what people say about the big bad developers coming in and changing the neighborhood. I mean, we're trying to provide more housing, and we're community builders. And even put the developer aside, like these are future homes for families and for people, and it seems like it's the worst thing in the world to some people. So go to a public meeting, support new housing supply.
That's a great point, because when I had Lanescapes on, I asked the question, how come by right in Toronto you can have a laneway home, but not anywhere outside of City of Toronto? And he was just saying because the voices are loud enough about the problems of housing affordability that they overwhelm the NIMBYs.
And that didn't happen overnight. I was actually involved in a lot of that laneway discussion in my previous role at the Ontario Home Builders Association. I co-authored a report with the Pembina Institute called Make Way for Laneway. And that was back in 2015. And it was talking about, and this was before laneway was allowed, and it was sort of promoting laneways as gentle density, not just as a housing opportunity, but a lot of these laneways were dead spaces. In some cases, they're a little dangerous. So how do you bring life to them? How do you bring eyes to the street? Huge opportunity. So yeah, now companies like Lanescape can come in, and there's as of right permissions, but that didn't happen overnight. That was a 4 or 5 year political advocacy issue that brought diverse groups together, be it groups like Lanescapes, be it community organizations, some environmental organizations like Evergreen, City Works, a Housing Supply Action Lab, my organization at the time, the Ontario Home Builders Association. So it was kind of a unique project where you had very diverse stakeholders saying, hey, this is a potential solution here. It's not going to survive, end the housing crisis, but we've got an opportunity to build hundreds of units on an annual basis in these dead spaces.
Privately. All
Yes.
privately. And they'll generate tax dollars for the city. Mike, again, thank you so much for doing this. Where can people follow along? Can you reshare your Twitter? Does West End Builders Association have a website?
Yeah, so look up, just Google West End Home Builders Association, and you will see our websites. We are at West End HBA on Twitter and on Instagram. My Twitter is at MikeJCW. People can shoot me an email, MikeCW at westendhba.ca. I'm happy to talk to anybody in the real estate sector, young people, students in particular, about housing. I could talk about housing and planning all day.
Okay, let's go for another hour. Mike, again, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. If you want to learn how to invest in real estate from scratch, my team teaches beginners how to use the #1 investment strategy in a virtual free training class every month. Go to investortraining.ca/podcast to register for our next class. I publish an episode here every week, so subscribe if you want to keep learning from seasoned investors like myself and my guests. Again, if you're ready to learn the nitty-gritty about real estate investing, register for our next free virtual training class at investortraining.ca/podcast. Again, thanks for listening to the show. Talk to you next week.